So, Caleb, I want to start off really with just getting to know you a little bit for the benefit of the students. You come from the great state of Texas, just like I do, and so why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, both educationally and experientially? You know, kind of how things have played out for you and what has gotten you to where you are now and what you do now. And so, just kind of lay it all out for us.
Yeah, so I actually started my career as a health professions advisor inadvertently as a student worker at my undergraduate institution at Baylor University, where I attended school. And I was actually an education major. I thought I wanted to be a coach. I thought I wanted to coach sports and be around athletics because that was what I was around my whole life. And then as a student worker, I got introduced to working with health profession students. And I had two incredible mentors and Dr. David Pennington at Baylor and Nancy Johnson at Baylor as well. And they taught me so much in those first few years. And I went away to do some stuff in sports, came back to Baylor to start my health profession advising career officially as not a student worker, but as an actual advisor at Baylor. And then spent a few years there, and then went down the road to Austin, where I spent some time as a health professions advisor at the University of Texas at Austin. And after a few years there, took the job as the director of health professions advising at Southern Methodist University. So if you can't tell, I've been around health professions advising and students and working with students for a long time. And recently, within the past 4 years or so, moved to Philadelphia, became an advisor at Temple University, and then became the admissions director for the Temple University College of Science and Technology post-bac program. So it's kind of an interesting overlap of having the experience of being the advisor and now kind of having this experience of doing admissions and seeing what things look like on the other side of things. So this is really fun because I think extracurriculars are such a huge part of both the undergraduate experience and also the admissions process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. You sort of start off in Waco at Baylor, come down south to Austin, back up north to Dallas to SMU, and then you get a wild hair and get off to Philadelphia and doing stuff there. But it's been a good ride for you, I'm guessing.
It's been great. I'm also a doctoral student at Temple as well. So working currently on my dissertation, which actually covers a lot of the topics of the things that I've seen throughout the day in a lot of these other sessions. And so it's been just really cool for me to see everyone interact. And also, as long as I've been doing this, I'm still learning some stuff today. So
yeah,
it's been fun.
Yeah, that's the whole point, right? Is that we learn until we die.
That's right.
Yeah, that's the big thing. Good. Well, Caleb, we're going to talk about extracurriculars today, and this is something that I think students think a lot about and worry a lot about, and think that sometimes they don't understand exactly what to do or when to do it or why to do it or things like that. And so I guess my first question for you is a straightforward question, and that is, are extracurriculars important?
It's a great question. I mean, I think I'll answer it simply and then I'll expand on it. But yes, I mean, they're very important. They help frame who you are as a person. They help frame who you are as a professional or as a future professional. They help frame who you are as just your interests too, just the things that you like to do outside of school, outside of work. And so, yeah, they're very important. Scott, we have a friend that we've known for many years, Dr. David Jones from UT San Antonio's medical school. And he used to say all the time to my students, if it is of value to you as an applicant, it is of value to us as an admissions committee. And I've always remembered that and thought that each time I evaluate a student and I'm reading those extracurriculars. So they're very important because they help you really define who you are. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the things they help you as an applicant prove too. So yeah, I mean, extremely important.
Yeah. I think, it's funny that Dr. Jones would always say that, because it's so accurate. And sometimes we get students who say, well, I don't really want to put my hobbies on there because they don't mean anything. They mean something to me, but they're not applicable to medicine or whatever. And what do you have? How do you respond to a student who says something like that?
Yeah, it's a common, I would say, mistake that where students will, even on applications to our post-bac program, they'll forget to include something that they thought wasn't necessarily quote unquote medically related. And you're right, because they don't think it's important, and it is. It tells us again the kind of person you are. And I always encourage students to kind of get involved as an undergrad in three areas. I tell them to get involved in something that develops them professionally. So these are the things that are obvious, things that are like your AED chapters in your undergrad, or shadowing at a hospital, or doing things that are clinical. Those are all things that develop you professionally down the road, but also things that develop you as a student, so academically. So these are things that sometimes students forget. If I'm an English major, get involved in a literary club. If you're a bio major, get involved in your Tri Beta chapter on campus. If you're a history major or a chem major, get involved in those corresponding student orgs that reflect those academic interests. Because again, those are of interest to us on an admissions committee. And then finally, the third kind of area that you want to develop is you as a person. So just personally, spiritually, whatever that may be. If running is a hobby and you love running marathons, that's fascinating to us. In fact, part of our interview day, when we go around our interview day and we do introductions, one of the things that we always ask our students is about a fun fact. So, we want to know where you're from and what your major was, and where you went to undergraduate school. But we always ask for a fun fact, because it's always fun to learn who is a baker, who's a bike rider, who rides hot air balloons, or whatever. And so those things are really important, because those are ways that you are going to interact both with your coworkers in a hospital or clinical setting, but they're also ways that you're going to interact with your patients. And the more common ground you can find with your future patients, it can help change the course of your interaction with them at a hospital.
Yeah, it's interesting when back in my days at UT Southwestern Med School, we used to laugh in the admissions committee that we would try to put together, runners. We knew that there were a bunch of runners, and we thought, okay, we got a track team here, or we would track how many of our students played musical instruments and try to put together an orchestra. And I say this a little bit tongue in cheek, but we would notice those things, and they were very important to us. That this was, as you said, this was something that they had an interest in, and it makes them three-dimensional people. It really makes them come alive to an admissions committee. And that's something that I think students need to keep in mind, that you're trying to show yourself as a real person, as this three-dimensional kind of person, and we want you to show those elements of yourself in your application. Very, very key, thing. So, and throughout this our time together, I'm going to just drop in questions as they come up, particularly if they're relevant. And we had one from the person known as I'm Studying.
Yep.
And the question is, how could we list hobbies on our application? So, knowing for example, the AMCAS application, can you talk a little bit about how somebody can represent themselves in an application with their hobbies?
Yeah. So, AMCAS, TMDSAS, ACOMAS, even post-bac CAS, which is the application service that we use for our post-bac program, all have different categories that you can put experiences in. And on AMCAS, for example, there's literally a category where you can list hobbies. So you can list them, you can mention them. At first I would encourage you that if you have a place where you can describe that, describe it to us first of all. So it may be an obvious hobby. If it's running, then we clearly all know what running is. But then after that, list what you learned from that. And one thing that may help is framing everything within the AAMC core competencies. I mention this to our students all the time. I see Sarah Lim is here. Sarah, hi. But she's probably sick of hearing me talk about the core competencies. You can find within those core competencies things that your hobbies many times overlap and intersect with, and you can highlight those in the descriptions of your experiences. So yes, there's a very specific way where you can list your hobbies and talk about them.
Right. Absolutely. It's funny too, because, AMCAS gives you basically 700 characters to talk about what this activity was. I think ACOMAS is about 600 characters. Unfortunately, TMDSAS is a limited 300 characters. But you have room to sort of talk about what this activity is all about, such as hobbies. And it's like you said, Caleb, we don't often have to say, well, I cook for my hobby, and that involves following a recipe and buying the ingredients. And, we get all that stuff. I think it's more an issue of telling, what does this do for you? What do you get out of this? Why is this important to you? What meaning do you get from this activity? And hobbies are important because more times than not, I think hobbies illustrate that this is what we do to decompress, to relax, to deal with stress. I've often seen things like yoga, the hobby of yoga, or the hobby of running is a very good example of it. How it, I'm not much of a runner, but how it clears your head, or right. Any kind of physical activity, hiking, kayaking, whatever the hobby is, very important, but what it means to you. And now I'm sure in terms of your work with your students at the post-bac program, you really talk to them a lot about this and talk to them a lot about, as you said, the AAMC core competencies. And just as an aside, if you're not familiar with the core competencies of the AAMC, I think all you have to do is Google AAMC core competencies, and you'll find it. And there are interpersonal competencies and there are intrapersonal competencies that you really need to become familiar with, and how these impact your life and how your activities represent those things. And there are things like resilience and determination and a variety of things that I think are very applicable when it comes to hobbies, especially. And so, good question. I'm studying, whoever you are, and we're glad that you took the time to ask the question. And but my point is that in these descriptions, you don't really necessarily have to say what they are, more than the basic amount of information, but really how it's important to you. Caleb, this is a pretty big point, isn't it, in terms of this issue of meaningfulness or value to them?
Yes, and I think it also it goes back to kind of what you were saying, and I always use the example of cameras in a movie. If you just had one camera in a movie pointed at one person from one angle the whole movie, it would be a really boring movie. And so the more cameras you can get showing you from more angles, the more interesting and multi-layered it becomes. And so think of all of these kind of experiences as different camera angles that are showing you and what you can do. One other thing I want to add about hobbies that I think is also really important is physician burnout is such a huge issue. And if you aren't able to demonstrate a way that you have a hobby that can help you balance yourself, help you learn how to ground yourself, somehow kind of de-stress after a long day at the hospital or clinic, it's difficult to prove to an admissions committee that you have balance in your life. And so hobbies are a really good way to say, I'm not always in the books, I'm not always working. Yes, I do that a lot. Surely my transcript and my test scores indicate that, but I also have these other layers to my life that help me stay balanced and keep me from burning out.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So we have I guess one other question we'll address about hobbies, and this is from Joe, and Joe's a frequent visitor and a frequent questioner. Hey, Joe, if we don't have space for our hobbies, is that detrimental? Should we 100% dedicate one slot to hobbies? Now, this is important because, particularly for AMCAS, not as important for ACOMAS or TMDSS, where you have multiple, as many slots as you want. Unfortunately, AMCAS only gives you 15 slots. And so here's the question: do I use a slot for hobbies? Is it 100% important? Is it detrimental if I don't devote one to hobbies? What are your thoughts about this question?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, but it kind of goes back to what Dr. Jones said. If it's of value to you, it's of value to your application. And if you don't feel it's valuable, if you feel like you're just kind of shoehorning a hobby into your list just to put it in there, then I would question whether or not it's something truly valuable and may add value to your application. So I wouldn't say not including one is detrimental. I wouldn't say that it's 100% necessary, but it does demonstrate that you have kind of this breadth of experiences and that you are an interesting person to be around, that your colleagues will enjoy being around you, and your patients will enjoy interacting with you as well. So I don't know if it's detrimental, but it's something that you really need to think about, and you really need to think about what value that experience adds to your application.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah,
None of these are just check boxes. I mean, you've heard this. I know Ryan talks about this all the time. None of this is check boxes. You really have to think about these as value added and not just something to put down.
Right. Yeah, another big category that students that we should really talk about, and that is the extracurriculars with regard to clinical activities, shadowing activities, these types of things, and really making it clear that you sort of know what you're getting into. Is that would you say, Caleb, that that's a real chief reason for these types of extracurricular activities? I mean, isn't it sufficient if I watch Grey's Anatomy on television and really like it?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you use that example because when Grey's Anatomy first came out, it was this huge motivator for a lot of people wanting medicine. And for admissions committees, that reason rang very hollow because it didn't demonstrate you have any true understanding of what the profession is really like. So I always say with these clinical experiences, you're trying to prove two major things you're trying to prove. And I think I actually heard Ryan alluded to this in another session because he and I have very similar opinions on this. First of all, you're trying to prove to yourself that this is the profession for you, that you know what you're getting into, at least as best you can, what the life of a physician or a dentist or a PA or whatever health profession you want to go into looks like. And so you're really trying to prove to yourself first and foremost. Then once you've determined, yeah, okay, I like this, because if you do this for an extended period of time and you say, you know what, maybe being a doctor isn't for me. I've been at this clinic for a long time and maybe this is not the profession for me. That's actually a good thing. That's helped you understand that maybe a different path is better for you. But the second thing that you have to do is prove to the admissions committee that you understand this profession. And so it's first proving to yourself that you know what you're getting into, and secondarily, proving to the admissions committee that you understand, or at least the best you can understand this job. You don't have to prove that you could do open heart surgery, but you have to prove that you understand what a doctor-patient relationship is like and what building that relationship and that trust is like.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I heard it said recently that that you check the boxes for you don't check the boxes for other people. So it's really a checkbox for me. Do I really understand this? Do I really get it? Do I really understand what a doctor does on a daily basis? And not just seeing patients, but writing notes and battling with insurance companies for my as an advocate for my patients, these are parts of what a doctor does, and this is why shadowing in particular is important, and clinical activities can really be vital in terms of that. We get a lot of questions about, well, how many hours is enough hours? Is that sound right to you, that question? When a student asks you that question, what goes through your mind?
You're right. It's a question we get all the time, and that's an unanswerable question. And I use a gym analogy to this all the time, like a workout gym. And I always say that if you told me that you spent 1,000 hours in the gym, and then I look at you, I can probably very easily tell whether you just walked into the gym and stood around, or if you went into that gym and you really worked out, and you worked out hard. So 1,000 hours to Scott, he may come out looking like he worked out, and I may not look any different than I did 1,000 hours ago. So you get that when you get to the interview, and you say, oh, I see you put down 1,000 hours of clinical experiences, and you wrote this beautiful description about it. Now tell me about it. And they can't. So you really want to make sure that, the hours aren't the important part. It's a component, sure. You want to try to accumulate a lot of those, but you need to make sure that when you're in those experiences and you're accumulating those hours, that you have your eyes and ears open. You're listening, you're learning, and it may not feel always active, but you're still learning about your surroundings and watching how good doctors interact with patients, and really taking that to heart.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We get a lot of questions about, the difference between shadowing and clinical activities. Can you kind of help us understand maybe a differentiation between those two, and why should I do one as opposed to the other, or why should I do both, or et cetera?
Yeah, I think doing both is probably the more practical aspect. You have to do what, especially in this day and age of COVID, you just have to be able to get what you can get as far as shadowing or clinical hours or observation hours. One is a bit more passive. You're just kind of watching. You're learning maybe from a distance. You may not actually be interacting with other patients or even healthcare providers at all, but it can still be an excellent learning experience. Whereas in a clinical encounter, you're probably getting a little bit more direct patient interaction. This usually comes with things like being a medical assistant or an EMT, where in some cases you're actually providing some level of healthcare to a patient. So I think they're all good. I don't think it's necessarily one is, I don't even know if I would say it's better, quote unquote, than the other, but clearly in an ideal situation, you're getting these hours with direct patient contact.
Yeah.
So, and I'll also say this too, while all of these kind of clinical experiences are great, don't let it distract you from the fact that you still have to do well in your coursework. You have to do well in your test prep, all of these kind of other academic components that we all hate kind of talking about and addressing, like grades and science GPA and MCAT score. You still have to be able to focus on those. And I think this is important because in the research that I'm doing for my dissertation, one of the things, and Scott and I were actually talking about this after I processed some of this data, is I found that there was kind of this negative correlation between the more hours a person accumulated and their ability to get accepted into medical school. And so Scott and I were talking, and I was like, why is that? And Scott said, it's probably students that have maybe lower credentials, grades, and scores that are trying to offset that by doing more clinical hours. So I would just caution people, yes, it's great to get those, but if it is distracting you from the main goal at hand, yes, I get it. Being in a hospital is fun. Being around that environment is inspiring, but use those as inspirational moments to keep you going, reminding you why you're fighting through physics and biochemistry. And use those to keep you fired up about the end result goal, and not letting them distract you from making A's in those courses.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we have a question here from Cam, I guess. Cam Cass. I also work at a chiropractic clinic doing treatments on patients, but I also do a lot of front desk work. Would I still be able to list this as clinical experience? What are your thoughts about this question?
Yeah, I in short, without knowing the details surrounding it. I would say at first glance, this looks like this is not a clinical experience. This is probably something that is more administrative. Again, not that it doesn't have value to your application, not that you're not learning a lot about how patients interact with the chiropractor in this case, but I would probably, again, I would probably list this as something that wasn't clinical. But many times positions like this can lead to opportunities that are more clinical. So after you work at a front desk a while, they get to know you, they get to trust you, they realize they can rely on you and that you are dependable. Then they may ask you, you may then kind of earn the opportunity to say, hey, would you mind if it's okay with you if I come back and maybe help you when you're working with patients? And so good experience. It's a good kind of introduction to it. It also, to Scott's point earlier, he was talking about how you don't always see the paperwork and the insurance and the phone calls and kind of those behind the scenes things. One of the things that you would see at the front desk are some of those things. And so you could mention that, yes, I've seen that side of things. And if you still want to be a healthcare provider after seeing those things, that's probably a good sign.
Yeah, definitely a good sign. That's true. That is true. Now, we also get a lot of students that are interested in volunteer work, community activities, things like that. You know, this is another important element of extracurricular work, and how should a student look at that? What is this all about, and why is it meaningful in terms of the world of the admissions cycle and all that? Why is volunteering a big deal?
Yeah, it's big because, and I'll go back to those 15 AAMC core competencies. There's one of them that is literally says service orientation, and so your ability to show that you are sensitive to the needs and the feelings of other people, that you show them how to be responsible in their society, locally and globally and nationally, I think is some of the wording behind the way that core competency is laid out. But medicine is a service profession, and if you're not, if you don't have kind of this heart of service built in, it can be harder to become a physician. And so, doing things that are service oriented demonstrates that you have that heart for service, and that I always tell students when they're in school, they have to be selfish so they can be selfless later. If that means, spending a little more time with studying. And so being service oriented demonstrates that selflessness that you don't always get to demonstrate when your head is jammed in a book and you're studying, a course to make an A.
Yeah, exactly. So Caleb, when should a college student start involving themselves in extracurricular activities?
This is a great question. Probably when I was an undergraduate health professions advisor, one of the most common questions I would get asked by freshmen is, when should I start? My gut says start right away. There's no real reason to not start right away, but I would encourage you that if you're a freshman, get your academic base built first. Get through that first fall, see how you're doing in the courses. And then as you make it through your freshman year, then maybe start to add some of those things in the spring or probably more likely in the summer following your freshman year. But I would say it's never truly too early. I think another thing to kind of remember here too is that on a lot of applications, and specifically TMDSAS says this, they don't want you to include anything that you did before college. So anything that you did in high school, they don't put much stake in on your application. And I think actually Ryan covered this again in his session too. So forgive me for reiterating, but it is an important point. The first thing I think of when I see a student that doesn't have many clinical experiences in college, and they're talking to me in my office and they tell me about all of those things that they did in high school, I say, well, why did you stop? Because the first thing I think of is your parents were telling you to do that when you were at home as a high school student. And now that you're in college and they're not breathing down your neck, telling you to do those things, you're not doing them. And so ease your way into them. But you need to continue to do those kinds of things when you're in college. And then you need to continue doing those things like winter break, spring break, summer break. Those are great pockets of time for you to try to get involved in extracurricular activities when you're not involved in your schoolwork.
Yeah, Absolutely. Yeah. Interesting. You mentioned the high school issue because we have a question about that. I think it says, "Oh, Henny says I was involved in a cultural organization throughout high school and into my first year of college when I became president of the organization. How would I include that since most of it is prior to college?"
That's a great question. There's a couple of ways you could do this, but I would personally probably go ahead and mention that you did this when you were in high school, just because you continued it into college. Um, Other people may have different opinions on that. An admissions committee may just choose to ignore the high school part. But if it's anything that you did in college and especially continued in, and particularly I see here president of the org, which would kind of fall into that leadership category
Mhm.
on your application, I could see that as being very important. And so
Yeah.
yeah, I would include all of that, especially if it's something that kind of overlaps the two. And then you leave it up to the admissions committee to determine how they want to view that. But
Yeah.
what I see in this is consistency, actually, that you got involved in something in high school that you found to be important, and it was so important that you continued doing it into college.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Yeah, and just to be clear, I think one of the things that we need to make sure, because this comes up particularly when it comes to research, and that is the issue of extracurriculars. The very definition of extracurricular means outside of the curriculum. So if it's in a class, if you did research in a class, this would not be extracurricular. This would be part of the curriculum of your course. If it's outside of your courses, if you're working in a lab, for example, and you're getting paid or you're volunteering in that lab, then this would be an extracurricular activity. Does that make sense? Does that sound right to you, Caleb?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Research is kind of one of those tricky ones because it's one that everyone kind of feels like they have to have on their app, but not everybody loves research, and quite frankly, you don't have to love research. That's actually just fine. So I would say that yeah, I would agree. If it's something you did in class, now that doesn't mean that a research project can't start with a professor that you meet in a class and you guys start working on something together, and then y'all decide to continue that research independently after the fact. That's perfectly acceptable within that research category. But
Yeah.
yes, I agree completely.
Yeah. Good. Um, so here's another question. This one's from Christina. I worked a month as a medical assistant in Miami. I learned so much and I had to drop it because of organic chemistry too, and labs are quite hefty over the summer. Totally understandable. Should I consider adding it to my application?
I would consider it for sure. I think this is, if it's on AMCAS and you're looking kind of at the totality of your application and you know that you have 15 slots to fill out, you might make a spreadsheet, start typing those 15 in there, and then see where this fits in the grand scheme of things. And if it's kind of a lower priority item that doesn't really fit in those top 15, maybe it wouldn't be something that you would want to include. But what I see here in your question that jumps out to me the most, and this is where I'm going to ask you to kind of put your money where your mouth is. You said, I learned so much. And so I think if you can articulate that in the description of really what you learned and why that was important to you, then sure, I think that could be something that you would want to include. I think the length of time is less important than really what you learned and if you truly did learn so much. Yep. But
Yeah.
I think in the end, if you dropped it to do better in an organic chemistry class, especially one that you're taking in the summer, in my mind, you did the right thing to focus on that class. But yes, I would consider adding it on your application.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sounds, I, again, and this isn't an issue with the DO schools or with the Texas application service. You have an unlimited number of spots. And so it could very clearly go on there. It's only with AMCAS that you start having to weigh what's the relative benefit. If I have more than 15, what do I do? So it's a big dilemma for a lot of students applying through AMCAS. So absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great question, though. That's
Yeah,
a
it's
good
a
question.
very good question. Here's a tough one.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I'm going to try to stump you, or the student is here. This is from Heather. AMCAS asks you to list work as either medical or non-medical. Would you be able to explain how to differentiate between the two? For example, working as a laboratory scientist for a biopharma company. So what does a student do? Clearly extracurricular, working and struggling to identify whether to determine if medical or non-medical. And sometimes there's a grayness here. How does a student deal with the gray?
Yeah, I would say this is definitely one of those gray areas. And I think this is where you would really need to kind of think about your job description, for lack of a better way of saying it. And what were you actually doing in this job? Were you cleaning lab equipment? Were you answering phones? Were you filing paperwork? Were you, entering things into a spreadsheet? The lab work that you're doing, is it more administrative? Is it very medically related? Do you have patients involved? Are you helping meet with patients, consulting with patients, and then maybe potentially, running samples back and forth to places, all the things that you can legally do when you're given these kinds of situations. And so I would say it really depends on it. I could see it going either way. My gut instinct here says this is non-medical. But again, I don't know the details of it. And I think this is the other thing too. Sometimes on these applications, don't overcomplicate it. Do what's reasonable and makes the most sense. You leave it up to the interpretation of the admissions committee, but you do the best to represent it in the most fair and reasonable way you can. And admissions folks, we're fair and reasonable people. We understand. We'll probably look at that job and we'll say, I know exactly what Heather did in this job. I don't necessarily think it's medical. If you had indicated it was medical and I didn't think so, I may say, I don't necessarily see this as medical, but I can still see value in it. And you probably wouldn't be penalized for miscategorizing it or categorizing it in a way that I feel is different. So again, just be reasonable and be fair, and we'll interpret it in the way. And again, if it goes in the faces of 20 different admissions committee folks, they all may evaluate it just a little bit differently or see it through a different lens.
And I think that's great what you just said, Caleb, that you really do, the student really doesn't need to overthink it. And I know that you pre-med students are super neurotic, and you overthink basically everything. And I get that. I totally get it. There's no judgment here on that. I totally get it. The point here is that you make the best effort that you can. And if you say it's medical, you explain why you think it's medical and the value that you got out of the experience. And then, as Caleb said, you leave it up to the admissions committee to sort of sort through that. They're not going to be all like, oh, well, this isn't medical. There's going to be a variety of opinions, I think, just like you said, Caleb. And I'm sure you guys see it all the time at the post-bac program. You see students who are saying, and as long as they make a good case for it, you may not necessarily agree with it, but you can see why they said that.
And to that point too, then it becomes a conversation point at an interview. So if you come in for an interview, we may ask you to follow up on that. I see you mentioned this as tell me about that experience. We may not say something as direct as, tell me about this. Was this medical or non-medical? But we'll definitely ask you to explain what you learned, explain what you felt like you got out of that experience. And in the end, we may even ask you, how do you think that's going to make you a better physician in the future? So hopefully you'll have an opportunity to kind of, for lack of a better term, defend yourself or at least explain yourself at an interview.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's awesome. The thing about extracurriculars too is that they should be fun. They should be activities that are fun for you to do, whether it's a hobby or whether it's a student organization that you're involved in. It should be something that's fun and that it really energizes you. Part of this is saying what is it that gives you energy? And one would think that if you're a pre-med student, that a clinical opportunity would do that. Talk for a second about Caleb, about the difference between depth in these activities and breadth in these activities. We sometimes hear a lot of students who say, well, I've got I've got choices of 14 different things, and I'm doing 4 things, and I'm, and I've got this, that, and the other thing going on, as opposed to a much deeper, much more meaningful time in maybe one or a few organizations. How does that impact this process?
Yeah, I think that's one of the best changes that the application service has ever made, was adding the ability for you to tag experiences as meaningful and then give additional depth to that explanation as to why. And I think you're right. I mean, there's a big difference, and again, it kind of goes back to those different camera angles. If you have 10 different camera angles all in one direction, and that's a lot. So you may want to think about the balancing and pulling out one of those and putting in something that demonstrates a different angle. So if you have 10 different lab experiences, and you can pull out 2 of those and maybe put into kind of different experiences that speak to a variety of angles of who you are as a person, there's benefit in that. And so, and then as I mentioned, you have the ability now to add those meaningful experiences and really talk about why that's meaningful, what that means for future practice, and how it impacted your continued motivation to become a physician.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And I agree with you completely, Caleb. The most meaningful parts are really a strong way to really emphasize those things that you felt like were so valuable in your life. Both AMCAS and TMDSAS give you the ability to identify those 3 most meaningful experiences and then give you that extra space to talk about why it was most meaningful. We certainly encourage for our students using MAP to do that through storytelling, to say, this is what I experienced, and I experienced this particular thing through a patient named John or Sarah or whatever, and to really explain through that story what they were doing and why it was important. So very, very awesome.
Yep.
These are great questions that we're getting here from
really are.
Yeah, really great students. So we're almost out of time. Let me see if we've got another question or so. Heather says it's important to listen to the way and discussing, and so we're getting lots of good responses and stuff. But any last words, Caleb, that really strike you? And when it comes to extracurriculars, what's the takeaway here for students? What should they really take away from this discussion?
I would say that as an admissions person myself, we really do want to get to know you. We want to get to know not just that you're going to make a good dentist or a doctor or a PA, but that we know what kind of person you're going to be, what kind of coworker you're going to be, what kind of colleague you're going to be, and hopefully how that will interact with you being a health professions provider one day. And so, be yourself. Tell us who you are. We don't want necessarily the best version of you. We just want the truest version of you. So put the best, the most true version of yourself down and do the best job you can of representing that on your application, and it'll shine. It'll show through.
Yeah, great. Well, Caleb, I just again, I want to thank you so much for being here with us. It's been great to see you. I know It's been helpful for the students, and I've certainly enjoyed it. And just keep on keeping on with the dissertation, and I'm sure we'll be talking soon about that. So,
yes, sir. So good to see you. You students, you guys have been great. Just one quick thing. Our Temple CST post-bac program application is still open till June 5th. So if you're interested in that, feel free to take a look at that. But Scott, thank you so much for inviting me today. This has been fantastic.